I'm Etzion Becker from Haifa, Israel. Today, the 4th of October 2025. We'll continue the reading of the Discourses of Meher Baba, the nature of the ego and its termination. And as usual, we start with a musical piece. This time, it's a close band, one of our associates, not my band, but we used to get together and share. Excellent band from the city of Kfar Saba. This is about 20 kilometers north of Tel Aviv. And many years ago, the mayor of this city knew that in order to teach the children mathematics and sciences, etc., and to be successful in general, the basis of education should be music. So he was concerned to make sure there are enough musical studies in the schools of his city, and it became one of the best musical hubs of Israel. So I'll start with a sharing concert, which we shared together at that time. Because we used to get together, my band and other bands, we used to get together. We might get together again with this band in the coming month, next year, I believe. I'll share with you again. So this was recorded during one of our meetings, to my remembrance. This was a wind band of Kfar Saba playing a medley of our Israeli songwriter and musician, Miki Gavrielov. He's very famous in Israel. I guess you're abroad, never heard his name. That's okay. Again, you can see the power of music, which can bring a few separate individuals to work together as one body. This is the reason why I keep on bringing pieces of music, not only for the sheer entertainment of youth, which is might be good as well. Point again and again, which I'm sharing it all the time, that we spiritual people, this is our duty first and foremost to form the spiritual circles which act like a musical band, but in a much, much higher spiritual scale or I would say quality. The participants must be aware that we are separate individuals. Each one has to be more or less centered on the divine beloved, or equivalent being, could be perfect master or world teacher, and all of them must work together with a living point of focus. There must be, and as we can see all over the creation, everything is a point of focus. The basic cell is a point of focus, atom is a point of focus, the galaxy is a point of focus, etc., etc. From the minutest circle to the largest universe, always a point of focus. And we have to recreate it. If we will not do it, and we are not doing it, troubles on earth will continue. Cannot be, there are no compromise in this. To have peace and quiet on earth without establishing spiritual circles, which would eventually recreate the spiritual government on earth, which would supposed to teach humanity how to do work without creating such thick, dangerous sanskars which we store in the subconscious mind as they are being reflected on the earthly sphere. And now I will continue reading the third chapter of the Discourses, speaking on these very issues. We read before the two chapters of the nature of the ego and its termination. This is part 3, the forms of the ego and their dissolution. The ego subsists upon mundane possessions like power, fame, wealth, ability, attainments, and accomplishments. It creates and recognizes the divine in order to feel what is distinctively mine. However, in spite of all the worldly things that it claims as mine, it constantly feels empty and incomplete. To make up for this deep restlessness in its own being, the ego seeks to fortify itself to further acquisitions. It brings the array of its entire varied possessions into relief by comparison with others who might be inferior in any one of the items stamped as mine. And it often uses these possessions for wanton and uncalled for self-display, even to the disadvantage of others. The ego is dissatisfied in spite of its mundane possessions, but instead of cultivating detachment from them, it seeks to derive satisfaction from a more intense sense of possession, in contradistinction to others. The ego, with an affirmation of separateness, lives through the idea of mind. The ego wants to feel separate and unique, and it seeks self-expression, either in the role of someone who is decidedly better than others, or in the role of someone who is decidedly inferior. As long as there is ego, there is an implicit background of duality. As long as there is a background of duality, the mental operations of comparison and contrast cannot be effectively stilled for long. Therefore, even when a person seems to feel a sense of equality with another, this feeling is not securely established. It marks a point of transition between the two attitudes of the ego, other than permanent freedom from the distinction between the I and the you. This pseudo sense of equality, where it exists, may be stated in the formula, I am not in any way inferior or superior to the other. It still at once be seen to be a negative assertion of the ego. The balance between the I and the you is constantly disturbed by the predominance of a superiority or inferiority complex. The idea of equality arises to restore this lost balance. The negative assertion of the ego in the form of equality is, however, utterly different from the sense of unity that is characteristic of the life of spiritual freedom. Although the sense of equality is made the basis of many social and political ideals, the real conditions of rich cooperative life are fulfilled only when the bare idea of equality is replaced by the realization of the unity of all life. The feelings of superiority and inferiority are reactions to each other, and the artificially induced feeling of equality might be regarded as a reaction to both. In all these three modes, the ego succeeds in asserting its separateness. The superiority complex and the inferiority complex, for the most part, remain disconnected from each other. They both seek separate and alternate expression through suitable objects, as when a person dominates those whom he regards as his inferiors and submits to those whom he looks upon as his superiors. But such alternative expression through contrasting behavior only accentuates these opposite complexes instead of leading to their dissolution. The superiority complex is stirred when a person meets someone who is in some way remarkably inferior in mundane possessions, in spite of its many possessions. The ego is constantly confronted with the spectacle of its intrinsic emptiness. Therefore, it clings to the comforting delusion of its worthwhileness by demonstrating the greatness of its possessions. This contrast is not confined to theoretical comparison, but often exhibits itself in actual clash with others. Thus, aggressiveness is a natural outcome of the need to compensate for the poverty of the ego life. The inferiority complex is stirred when a person meets someone who is in some way remarkably superior in respect to mundane possessions, but his submissiveness to the other is rooted either in fear or selfishness. It can never be wholehearted or spontaneous because there is a lurking jealousy of and even hatred for the other for possessing something he would rather have for himself. While forced and outward submission is purely the effect of an inferiority complex and can only enhance the ego in one of its worst forms. The ego attributes its sense of emptiness to the apparently inferior possessions it can claim as mine, rather than to its deep-rooted viciousness in seeking fulfillment through possession. Awareness of its inferiority in possessions becomes only a further stimulus for making desperate efforts to add to its possessions through such means as are available to it. Thus, while perpetuating the immoral poverty of the soul, the inferiority complex, like the superiority complex, constitutes an agent for selfishness and social chaos, and for the accumulation of that type of ignorance which characterizes the ego. When a person comes into contact with a perfect master and recognizes him as having the state of egoless perfection, he voluntarily surrenders himself to the master. The disciple perceives the ego to be a source of perpetual ignorance, restlessness, and conflict, and he also recognizes his own inability to terminate it. But the self-surrender should be carefully distinguished from the inferiority complex because it is accompanied by awareness that the master is ideal and as such has a basic unity with the disciple. Such self-surrender is in no way an expression of loss of confidence. On the contrary, it is an expression of confidence in the final overcoming of all obstacles to the help of the Master, appreciation of the divinity of the Master, the manner in which the higher self of the disciple expresses its sense of dignity. In order to bring about a rapid dissolution of these two chief forms of the ego, the Master may deliberately steer both of these complexes in alternation. If the disciple is on the point of losing heart and giving up the search, he might arouse in him deep self-confidence. If he is on the point of becoming egotistic, he might break through this new barrier by creating a situation in which the disciple has to accept and recognize his own incapacity or futility. Thus, the Master wields his influence over the disciple to expedite the stages that the melting ego passes through before its final disappearance. The superiority-inferiority complexes have to be brought into intelligent relation with each other if they are to counteract each other. This requires a situation in which both would be allowed to have the play at the same time, without requiring the repression of one in order to express the other. When the soul enters into a dynamic and vital relation with the Master, the complexes concerned with the senses of inferiority and superiority are both brought into play, and they are so intelligently accommodated that they counteract each other. The disciple then feels that he is nothing himself, but in and through the Master he is enlivened with the prospect of being everything. Thus, at one stroke, the two complexes are brought into mutual tension and tend to annihilate each other in the attempt the disciple makes to adjust himself to the Master. The dissolution of these opposite complexes, there comes a breaking down of the separative barriers of the ego in all its forms. With the breaking down of the barriers of separation, there arises divine love. With the rising of divine love, the separate feeling of I, as distinguished from you, is swallowed up in the sense of their unity. For a car to move toward its destination, a driver is necessary. However, the driver may be susceptible to strong attractions for things that he encounters on the way, and he might not only halt at intervening places for an indefinite time, but also get lost by the wayside in pursuit of things that have only temporary charm. Thus, he might keep the car moving all the time, but without coming nearer the goal, and he might even get further away from it. Something like this happens when the ego assumes control of human consciousness. The ego may be compared to a driver who has a certain amount of control over a car and a certain capacity to drive, but who is in complete darkness about its ultimate destination. For a car to reach its ultimate destination, it is not enough merely to have someone who can drive the car. It is equally necessary that this driver should be able to direct the car towards the destination. As long as the movement of consciousness is under the full and exclusive domination of the ego, the spiritual advancement of the person is jeopardized by the natural tendency of the ego to strengthen the separative barriers of false imagination. So, Because of ego-centered activities, consciousness remains enclosed by the wall of its own creation and moves within the limits of this myopic prison. If consciousness is to be emancipated from its limitations, rendered adequate to serve the original purpose for which it came into existence, it must draw its directive momentum not from the ego, but from some other principle. In other words, the driver who is ignorant of the ultimate destination must be exchanged for another driver who is free from all the allure of accidental things encountered on the way, and who centers his attention not on the rest of its stations or side attractions, but on the ultimate goal of non-duality. The shifting of the center of interest from unimportant things to truly important values is comparable to the transference of power from the ignorant driver to the driver who knows the destination. Concurrent with this gradual shifting of the center of interest, there is progressive dissolution of the ego in motion toward the truth. If the ego were nothing but a medium for the integration of human experience, would be possible for one to get established in the final truth merely by carrying further the activity of the ego, but while playing a specific part in the progress of consciousness, the ego also represents an active principle of ignorance that prevents further spiritual development. The ego attempts the integration of experience, but it does so around the false idea of separateness. Having taken an illusion as a foundation for the construction of its edifice, it never succeeds in anything but the building of illusions one upon another. Arriving at the truth is actually hindered rather than helped by the function of the ego. The process of arriving at the truth can be fruitful only if the integration presided over by the ego is carried further without bringing in the basic ignorance of separation. As long as human experience lies within the limitation of duality, integration of experience is an essential condition for a rational and significant life. But the ego, as a nucleus for integration, has to be renounced because of its inevitable alliance with the forces of ignorance. There arises then an imperative need for a new center of integration that will steer clear of the basic ignorance of separateness and will allow free scope for the incorporation of all values formerly inaccessible to the ego center. Such a new center is provided by the master, who expresses all that has real value and who represents the absolute truth. The shifting of interest from unimportant things to important values is facilitated by allegiance and self-surrender to the master. It becomes a new nucleus for integration. The master, when truly understood, is a standing affirmation of the unity of all life. Allegiance to the master, therefore, brings about a gradual dissociation from the ego nucleus, which affirms separateness. After this important crisis in the life of an individual, all mental activity has a new frame of reference, and its significance is to be gathered in the light of its relations to the master, as a manifestation of infinite truth, not in the light of any relation to the ego center as a limited I. The person's force finds that all acts that flow from him are no longer initiated from the limited I, but are all inspired by the truth working through the master. He is also no longer interested in the well-being of the limited self, but is only interested in the master as representing universal and undivided life. He offers all his experiences and desires to the master, reserving neither the good nor the evil for the limited I, stripping the ego of all content. This advancing bankruptcy of the ego does not interfere with the process of integration because the function is now performed around the new center of the master as representing the truth. When the ego nucleus is completely bankrupt and devoid of any power or being, the master as truth is firmly established in consciousness, its guiding genius, animating principle. This constitutes both the attainment of union with the master and the realization of the infinite truth. As the ego gradually adjusts itself to the spiritual requirements of life, through the cultivation of humanity, selflessness and love, wholehearted surrender, and offering oneself to the Master as truth, it suffers a drastic curtailment, not only offers less and less resistance to spiritual unfoldment, but also undergoes a radical transformation. This eventually turns out to be so great that in the end, the ego, the affirmation of separateness, completely disappears and is substituted by the truth, which knows no separateness. The intermediate steps of slimming down the ego and softening its nature are comparable to the trimming and pruning of the branches of a wild and mighty tree, while the final step of annihilation of the ego amounts to the complete uprooting of this tree. When the ego disappears entirely, there lies knowledge of the true self. Thus, the long journey of the soul consists in developing from animal consciousness the explicit self-consciousness, the limited I, then in transcending the state of the limited I of human consciousness to the medium of the master. At this stage, the soul is initiated into the consciousness of the supreme real self as an everlasting and infinite I am, in which there is no separateness and which includes all existence. Next week, we'll continue dealing with the issue of sanskaras. And all these two issues of the ego and sanskaras are the mysteries of creation. How come we came from the manifestation, from oneness, from divine love, all of us were being ejected. They called the creation, loveless creation, with hostile and all kinds of what we call bad forces are clashing against each other. And we are being caught in the mazes of all this unacceptable, crazy situation. And you ask, where is God in all this? So in order to discover God again, you have to reinstate the spiritual circles, and God will be re-manifest again on earth. In the original sin, in the Garden of Eden, we told God, and it's the problem of judgment between good and evil. That you, Mr. God, does know how to run the show. Go away from it. That's why God is not here. You told him to go away. So he's very shy. He doesn't want to come back. He'll be really willing, will able to come to the state of completely broken hearts. then we will come back. And then here and there it comes back to individuals who reach this state of mental bankruptcy and they would enter their lives, like myself and others in this community and other communities. And to see again and again. This reason why I keep on sharing the musical pieces, where you can see a group of figures can get together and work together with harmony under the conduct of a dictator or conductor or conductors. They are all loving it dictators. Without them, we can perform the music. Thank you very much. See you next week.